Welcome all to the Audit the Audit radio show. Today is a very special episode. We will be having our first guest on the series. I'm sure that many of you who watch ATA are relatively familiar with other channels that produce similar content, one of which being a channel known as LackLuster. LackLuster certainly has established himself on YouTube as a prominent figure within the auditing community and the First Amendment activism community. And we should have an interesting conversation. I'm going to try to get him on the line now. Hello? Hello?
Hey, John.
Hey, how's it going, Lack?
Hey, pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing well. It's good to hear from you. Can you hear me okay? Is everything sounding good? Hello? I take that as a no.
I was trying a microphone, and apparently it's not working. So I'll use a microphone.
No worries, man. You sound fine to me.
All right. Perfect.
Before we get into everything, I just want to remind everyone that this is a live show. There may be some technical difficulties over the course of the program, and to bear with me as I figure that all out. As I mentioned in the last broadcast, much of this is very experimental, and I'm still, working out the kinks. So, before we get into the questions and sort of the interview side of this, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about yourself and your channel and just say kind of what you want to say about what you think people should know about your content.
Sure. Well, I initially started my channel in 2017 and, made content for video games and, did a bunch of live streaming off of the YouTube platform and fairly similar to your story, I had a negative interaction with law enforcement agency in my town, and that was kind of my trial by fire. It just snuck up on me. I never expected to be anything more than an audience member in the auditing community, even though I'd been watching it for years. But that one incident just threw me off the cliff and started what I'm doing now. So.
And do you remember when you decided to create a YouTube channel out of that interaction? Because for me, it was like 2 months before I really got to that point and harped on that, interaction enough to decide to start making content around this niche.
Yeah, again, very similar. It was about a 2-month period for me. That incident happened last year, September 25th. I was still live streaming. I was very successful just playing video games, and I'd been doing that for years at that point. And it had started getting really boring, like almost there was no purpose behind it other than making money playing video games. And so I just kind of started feeling really negatively about it. And when my first video went up regarding a police encounter, it took me about 2 months also to stew on it, and I really didn't do anything else until December of 2019, and since then it's just been go time for this whole police accountability and the whole auditing community.
Yeah, well, one of the first questions I wanted to get into, a lot of people consider what you do and what I do sort of a form of journalism, and in that way, it is different. It kind of sets itself apart from what we view as traditional journalism. And I just wanted to get your take on, the current state of journalism as a whole. And, a sort of follow up to that is, does that represent the interest of the public?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many facets to that. Mainstream media has certainly evolved over the years, and I think now with the creation of YouTube and other social media platforms, journalism has evolved itself into everybody is a journalist. And especially with these cell phones and all this new technology that we have. And of course, there are some negatives to it. I think the cell phone world and all these new technologies create sort of like a solitudal society where people kind of shut themselves in, and it kind of puts ourselves away from community. But at the same time, it's also allowing us to expose things that wouldn't have otherwise been exposed through mainstream media. I think one of the first real big cases that we can all look back on is the Rodney King beating. And prior to that incident, when video cameras and at the time there were no cell phone cameras, but prior to the widespread use of video cameras, those cops would have gotten away with it, and now we're seeing all this new technology being able, it allows us to expose more and to learn more. And to a degree, I think sometimes we get flooded with too much information, but I absolutely think it represents a better interest of the public in the sense that, there's more information to base a decision on.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the only real point of contention that I might draw from what you were saying, and I find it, you're very right about the fact that, digital technology seems to have created some kind of personal divide between human interaction, just humans interacting with each other. But I also think, if you think about what people are actually doing on their cell phones, most of the time it is communicating, a lot, whether that be through social media or something. So it's sort of a give and take. Like, while we have lost all of this physical human interaction, it seems like we've gained a wealth of digital interaction that we never had before. But is that an adequate supplement for the traditional human interaction? I don't think so. But I don't think that everything that's coming out of our loss, as much as we're devoting ourselves to technology, I don't think that it's all bad,
Agreed. Yeah.
So, we were talking about journalism and how it's sort of taken this morph over the years and shifted to where it sort of makes everyone a journalist, like you were saying. And I was
Yeah.
wondering, well, what separates someone who, uses a platform like YouTube for their journalism from a journalist who operates in the mainstream media?
Well, in a lot of ways, as YouTubers, we're beholden to the terms of services, and all of the platforms that we're posting on. But if that's really all that we're beholden to, I think YouTube journalists, or this new free press that is we the people, we have much more of an opportunity to tell the truth or to tell a side of a story. And mainstream media like CNN, Fox News, all that, they're absolutely subject to the whims of the viewers and their advertisers. And obviously, if you watch my channel, it's obvious that I have a bias. So a lot of times I don't consider myself necessarily a journalist, more of an activist, because I don't think true journalism can be. I don't think journalistic integrity can be held up if there is a bias behind it. But what we see with not only channels like mine, but also mainstream media channels like Fox News, CNN, there's a definite bias. And typically if they sway away from it, including myself, if I were to jump on the channel tomorrow and say all cops are good, back the blue and all that kind of stuff, I think a large percentage of my viewer base would turn their back on me. So, but it is nice to at least have a platform and a medium where I get to choose my bias and I get to choose what I'm reporting on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's interesting that you take note of your bias and you sort of openly accept that bias, because a lot of, one of the biggest problems with mainstream media is that they sort of surreptitiously represent a certain bias, and all mainstream media tries to, shroud itself in this veil of objectivity, when anyone with eyes and ears can tell that that's not the case. But I think, getting back to the question that I originally asked, is I think that YouTube, also gives you the freedom to be upfront about your bias and, confront that and sort of portray yourself in a way that, like you said, attracts a certain group of people. And, especially if you consider yourself an activist and less of a journalist, you have a mission with that, and finding an audience that identifies with that mission is sort of a critical role in success. And I think that you're doing that well, to say the least. And I think that you being honest about that adds a lot of integrity to your message, instead of trying to do what normal journalists and mainstream media journalists, and I've witnessed this firsthand. They they want to craft a story in a certain way. I mean, you can read a story on Fox News and the same story on CNN and get completely different conclusions, and we see that happening every day.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw, how Facebook does one of those, hey, you posted this a few years ago or whatever.
Right.
A perfect example of this is I took a screenshot of, there's when you go on your phone, you open Google and you pull up the news section, and then it has a bunch of articles. And the top article was by like Vice News, and it was how President Trump is creating the worst economy or something. And then immediately underneath it was Fox News, and it's like Trump has created the best economy. And it's like they're both using the same set of numbers, but there's
Right.
something. They have an obvious message and an audience that they're trying to reach. And I think being honest about that absolutely attracts a more devoted crowd, devoted audience.
Well, there's an old saying that sort of circulates the journalism industry, and it goes something like, statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics. And it's very,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's very easy to manipulate interpretations of data. And it lets people, it sort of panders to their misconceptions and misinformation about the world and all of the things within it, all of the happenstances that are occurring.
Yeah.
But moving on, so we sort of, I was wondering, you said that you're an activist, and I respect that position. But I still consider you somewhat of a journalist, because a lot of times on your channel, you do a lot of research, and you sort of dig up some of the facts, whether or not those facts are, influenced by your bias, like we were talking about earlier. That's sort of irrelevant, because the standard of journalism seems to align with that nowadays. And I'm
Yeah.
curious about, where does your channel sort of fit into that spectrum of journalism and activism? I mean, do you consider yourself at least somewhat of a journalist?
Yeah. I mean, I guess so. I mean, I know that you have a background in journalism, and so I imagine that you've studied it. You've probably have some education, formal education regarding it. And I really haven't had anything of the sort, and I don't think that that's necessary to become a journalist per se. And for most of my videos, I spend quite a bit of time. I do a lot of videos where it's like, hey, I think this audit is fantastic. Go check out this channel. And it's simple. I don't really go any deeper than that. But on the ones that I do deep dives, where it's more in line of the type of work that you do, I'll spend hours researching, and a lot of times I find different different Supreme Court rulings or all sorts of different rulings and legal things that I didn't know before, that allow me to better just display what the story is about, or what's happening.
Right. So that, to me, like you were saying, I, as someone who does have a formal education, I have a degree in journalism. I went through, the ropes, and I've spent time in the field. I completely agree that you do not need a degree in journalism to be a journalist. But I do think
Yeah.
that there are certain credentials that um, I consider to be important to whether or not you consider yourself a journalist. And I think one of those is integrity. And, as much as that is sort of fading away from the field of journalism, I think that, if you're not producing stories that shed light on something or that give the reader an objective to read, it sort of gets away from the whole aspect of journalism as a whole. And it kind of just creates this environment where people are just sharing ideas and not facts. And a lot of
Yeah.
times those ideas are presented as facts. And you can see that in mainstream media, where there are there are many shows, for example, like Tucker Carlson, or on the left, there are many shows on the left that sort of present these narratives as some sort of factual basis that people can draft opinions from. And I think though that you don't necessarily do that so much. You talk about things and you present the facts, and although it is in the forefront of every audience member's mind that yes, you do have a perspective, it doesn't dominate the information, that you may or may not find. So I think, what I'm getting at here is you should give yourself a little more credit. I think that you do a lot of good work, and especially particularly that speeding ticket video. I thought that was very interesting and thoughtful and well researched, and that the reader could really gain something from that. And your bias
Yeah.
wasn't a prevalent factor in that video.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's always been of my personal belief that anybody who wants to be a journalist is a journalist. But I like your caveat that integrity is necessary for it. I appreciate that sentiment.
Yeah, the First Amendment, a lot of people think, freedom of the press. That is, one of the tenets of the First Amendment, and people think that that somehow creates this division between citizens and press. And that wasn't the intention, and that hasn't been the interpretation of that particular aspect of the First Amendment since its inception. The press is the people, and the people are the press. So any amount of rights that are associated with press are also rights that are granted to the people. So in my eyes, anyone can be a journalist if they're at the right place at the right time.
Exactly.
So getting more into that, and I kind of want to hang on to this journalism topic for just a little bit longer. Um,
Sure.
so what do you think about there being a connection between the media, particularly mainstream media, and the police and their image to the public? Is there a connection there, and what does that look like?
Well, I think over this past year, we've seen that specific connection become much more prevalent. You see more center-right forms of mainstream media advocating for more police or defending the blue, and more of the center-left spectrum of the mainstream media is more backing the defund the blue movement. So I definitely think that there's a political bias in mainstream media and how that affects the police. And likewise, I think it carries over to our style of journalism on YouTube and other social media platforms. I think both sides have a story to tell, and it's always worth a conversation, or at least reporting on it and letting people talk.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how the mainstream media has sort of taken it upon themselves to embrace certain narratives, and even propagate certain narratives when, say all the facts aren't necessarily there. And
Yeah.
you see this a lot when, my channel focuses very much on trying to be objective and looking at things through the lens of the law as it is interpreted and understood by our courts. And oftentimes I see headlines on both sides of the spectrum that sort of paint a different picture than what you would expect, or like, for example, you'll get a headline that says, so and so officer did this or that, and then on the right you may get the exact opposite headline where you're seeing, so and so criminal did this or that, and they'll be talking about the same story. That sort of narrative very much happened with the George Floyd incident, and it's just kind of a curious case of what exactly is the mission of something like that. It just kind of makes me think that are they just getting clicks, or is there a end goal there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, I mean, obviously, these large foundations that you see on TV that have been established for decades have an incentive to make a profit, especially with as much money as they're shelling into what they are contributing to journalism. So I imagine that a large part of it has to do with getting the clicks, making the money, and a lot of times that's all it is you need that type of headline or thumbnail or picture, whatever you want it is, to get those people to click into your story so that they can continue to make that revenue. But I do think that there are specific connections between a lot of the mainstream media platforms and political narratives. CNN obviously does really well when Trump is in office. Fox News does really well when, a liberal is in office. So, they're able to kind of push their negative narrative against the ruler at said given time and make money off of it. And I think that the money making and pushing a narrative kind of just go hand in hand. I don't think really you can have one with the other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's sort of, seems like how everything is operating. It's sort of like when I was in college for journalism, they sort of coined this new term called infotainment, where you're taking information and you're turning it into entertainment, and that seems to be sort of the kind of direction that journalism is heading in.
That kind of falls behind that line. If it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sensationalism.
Right. Yeah. I want to shift gears now from the whole journalism conversation and sort of talk more about specifically policing. What do you think, in your opinion, is the best way to have a productive information or encounter with members of law enforcement?
Well, I think the number one thing is absolutely know the law in your area and know your rights. Don't engage, and if you have to engage, lawyer up. Obviously, this is my own personal bias, but cops are not your friend. Their only purpose is to try to figure out a reason to either lock you up or force you to pay a fine, etc. So if you're looking for an interaction with law enforcement, I would say those are the absolute necessary things to do. I see quite a few auditors, and when they go out, and I don't mean any disrespect to any of them at all, because they're doing something that I personally don't, but I see a lot of them that are misquoting laws or misstating which laws they thought they were saying, or and I think that can get them in a lot of trouble. And sometimes I don't even think it might. I don't even know if it would be worth it to let the cop know that those laws, or I don't know. It's really hard to say on this side of the auditing spectrum, because you got SJVT's in chat right now, and I know he does very similar work to us too, but he also goes out into the street, but he's also very educated and knowledgeable, and a lot of guys like that are absolutely respectable because they know exactly what they're doing, what they're getting into, and how to get out of it. But for anybody else, I don't know, if you're not auditing, or whatever, know the law, lawyer up, don't engage.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point, and I've talked about this in a couple of previous episodes, and I believe I touched on this subject in the last radio show. Was that a surface level understanding of the law can benefit you a lot. It can definitely help you navigate a police encounter, but just as much as it can benefit you, it can also harm you, because if you have misconceptions about the law that you passionately defend, that oftentimes ends up in an arrest and a conviction. And it's so important to have not only be aware of the law, but have an understanding of it, and to be sure that what you're saying is absolutely true. And it definitely, like you were saying, there's a lot of people within the auditing community who, kind of go out there with sort of a lot of misconceptions about the law, and a lot of, bad ideas and sort of myths that have circulated, and they didn't really do their due diligence beforehand. And it's definitely important to take your time and do it right.
Yeah, because I think there's a very fine line between auditing and civil disobedience, and I think both hold extreme weights. Auditing is certainly extremely important to not only educate the public, but also the police, the law enforcement agencies, as they abuse civil rights. But if your goal is specifically civil disobedience, with the intention to go out and break laws that don't really have a victim or anything like that, go for it. But just know that it might not turn out the best for you. But I applaud both.
Yeah, and I that's another thing that I think people, I want people to know about my channel, is that although I may disagree with your approach, and I may, say give a harsher grade because of the approach, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong. I'm no authority on this. I'm just giving a perspective at the end of the video. It's not like this is the final say and I'm absolutely right. I could definitely be wrong. But this, the whole grading thing is it's just an opinion. And my opinion is that you gain nothing by being vulgar and disrespectful, and that there's really nothing separating you from the people that you don't like, the police that are often abusing their authority. You're sort of abusing your rights when you go out and you act that way. But is that wrong? Not necessarily. I mean, you have a First Amendment right to be that way. It's just that, my perspective is that if I were to audit, that's not how I would do it,
Yeah. And I think there's something to say about that specifically. I come from the mindset that I started my auditing viewing career watching guys like Bao, And I absolutely love his style, even though he is one of the most aggressive auditors out there. And I think it's important to have a wide variety of different auditors. Guys like Rowdy Podcast, who never, if ever, raises his voice, let alone cusses at anybody. But I think having the spectrum of auditors that are tame and respectful all the way to the most belligerent is extremely important, because it gives the cops a wide variety of citizens to deal with and how the law applies to each one of those types of interactions.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely valid perspective to have. My main complaint about people who sort of take on that role as being a vulgar auditor is that it sort of paints a picture, like say an officer who's never encountered an auditor before comes upon someone like that, and that's their impression of auditors from now on. And
Yeah, I can
like,
see that.
like we were talking about earlier, the media likes to, get clicks, and auditors like that just offer the media on a silver platter a way to discredit the movement. And it's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to craft a legitimate organized movement with a mission when you have pretty much all police officers and all of the media saying that these are just a bunch of vulgar guys who barely understand their rights and who just want to antagonize people.
Yeah, I can get on board with that too.
So this is a question that was submitted by Superstar 01, who's I asked people to submit some questions before we started the broadcast, and he asks, what are some plausible methods in avoiding labels such as liberal or Antifa when trying to be proactive about police reform?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I get categorized daily on my channel either as both liberal or Antifa. I've been told that I'm helping usher in globalism and the communist movement and yada yada, which I'm none of the above. But how do we avoid it? I think the most important thing that we can do as journalists and as auditors, people who have panels, is to define our terms, and really educate the public on where your perspective is coming from. If you're a statist, let them know. What side of the state are you? Are you not a statist? Let them know. But realistically, it's gotten to the point for me personally that I don't engage those comments anyway. But I don't know. Either brush it off or define your terms. That's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Defining your terms is something that I think the auditing community has sort of struggled with. And a lot of that sort of goes back to the fact that there are so many different, it's sort of fractured the whole movement. And, you even have auditors who hate other auditors within the community, which is, kind of counterproductive. And it creates this environment where no one's going to take you seriously if you don't take yourself seriously. And having a concise, set of terms and saying we as a group are all working towards this goal is definitely a way to avoid certain labels. But at the same time, I also think, is it even possible? Because with the current, climate that we live in, the social climate that we live in, it's impossible to be objective. I mean, when you like take, I don't want to harp about myself or my channel, but a lot of, ATA gets a lot of hate from both sides of the spectrum. I get emails from retired officers and pro police who, say that I'm too harsh on police officers, and then I get emails from auditors who say that I'm not doing enough, or that they're telling me that I'm wrong about certain things. So, and I think a lot of that, it's sort of it inspires me to keep doing things how I'm doing them, because it tells me that if I'm if both sides hate me, then I must be somewhere in between them. You know,
Yeah,
uh,
that's fair.
it just kind of it's created this landscape where if you imagine, a line, and anti-police being on one side and pro-police being on the other. If you happen to fall directly in the middle of that line, then you're an enemy to both. And it's not just
Yeah,
you can't sort of exist in the plane of what's real and factual without being drafted into these narratives that sort of circulate around those.
yeah.
It's a scary thing. So, what is the first thing that you would like to see changed about policing?
Well, I go back to I guess the the solid three that are kind of kicked around in the auditing community. Me personally, I would like to see qualified immunity just abolished nationwide for not only police officers but legislators and judges. I'd love to see the unions be banned for police officers, and then some type of individual liability insurance for police officers as well. Those are like the top three that I typically advocate for. But I also think that they're on top, and just to kind of piggyback on the independent liability insurance, a police officer should be forced to carry something like malpractice that doctors would have. I think that, you have the post, the police officer standard training,
Right.
and most states, I'm pretty sure all states have post, but it's not a nationalized standardization of training. So we need some sort of nationalized standardization of training, and we need it to be documented where if, let's say you have a police officer with three uses of excessive force, why does that person still have a job? We need to keep track of these people and set some sort of number or something that bans them from just resigning from one department, crossing state lines, and joining another one.
Yeah, that happens all too often. And, sometimes they don't even have to cross state lines. They can just go to the next
Yeah.
town. Um,
Yeah.
but I think you're very much spot on. I think, though, a lot of the thing about qualified immunity is that it didn't start out being what it is today.
Right.
It used to be something that was reasonable, and it was amended in, I think, 2009, I think, to where it it used to be based on the idea of whether or not a constitutional right was violated, and
Yeah.
that was the only standard for qualified immunity for a long time. And then when they amended it, they sort of changed that to say, well, we have to know that this for sure is a violation of a constitutional right. And if these specific circumstances involved in this specific interaction have never happened before, then there's no clearly established doctrine. And it shifted to being, forget about whether or not a constitutional right was violated. Let's focus on whether or not this has happened before and it's been clearly established that this shouldn't happen. And
Yeah.
that's sort of, created this precedent where if, the exact variables of this encounter weren't met and create this end, then just forget about it, because now we have this precedent going forward. It'll never happen again. Justice has been served. And
Yeah.
of course, that doesn't, it's easily manipulated within the court system. And it's very
Yeah.
much, yeah, go ahead.
And yeah, I was going to say one of the things I don't understand about qualified immunity too, and the way that it is established today. There's a well-known mantra in the United States that ignorance of the law is no excuse for breaking the law, right? But that
Mhm.
only applies to citizens. And when it comes to law enforcement agencies, law enforcement officers, and judges and legislators, the ones creating, enforcing, and ruling on law, they should be the most educated on those laws, but yet they have sovereign immunity, it's just it's really baffling. It's mind blowing.
You're right. It's a double standard, no doubt. And the thing about it is like no other industry has qualified immunity. I mean, you can't work at McDonald's and undercook a burger or something like that, and then them say, well, it wasn't clearly established in the training manual that we shouldn't cook a burger to this temperature, so we can't fire you for that. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't translate to any other industry. And if you make the kind of mistakes that cost people their lives, it doesn't make sense to be able to continue working. But does that mean that you should be prosecuted for every mistake that you make as a police officer? I think that there should be some degree of, you know, liability protection for officers. And, I'm sure that there are some encounters where they made honest mistakes. And
Yeah.
they shouldn't necessarily be held to such a high degree of scrutiny that anytime they do something small, or anytime that they encounter a situation they've never had to encounter, never trained for, and stuff like that, they shouldn't be susceptible to a civil lawsuit at every turn. But there
I would
also,
agree with that.
yeah, there also should be a healthy degree of accountability associated with that, which there is not.
Yeah, the Colorado just I think it was in June, put out, what's his name? Governor Polis put out an executive order that allows cops, or basically abolishes qualified immunity for civil suits against law enforcement officers up to $25,000. And I applaud them for being the first in the nation to do that. But I would say the only negative thing that comes to mind with that situation is the possibility for egregious and just BS civil lawsuits against police officers, which is something I don't want. Again, something like that could not necessarily nullify the movement, but shed us in a bad light, or at least people that are attacking the cops, or in civil litigation.
Yeah, I've even covered incidences on ATA where, some sort of interaction occurred that resulted in a massive settlement, and in my opinion, it was purely an abuse of the city's willingness to dump out settlements, because a lot of cities, like particularly in Colorado, Denver, for example, they set aside a certain amount of money every year just to settle police lawsuits, because it's almost as if they're accepting the inevitable fact that they will have to pay out money because of the shortcomings of not just their officers but the court system. And
Yeah.
a lot of the problems associated with qualified immunity and with police settlements and police misconduct really can be pinpointed to the way our justice system operates as a whole. And it just kind of it oftentimes it plays into that same bias where you may encounter a judge who is very pro police and you won't get any kind of settlement, or you may encounter a judge that is very anti-police, and or they sympathize with a specific set of values that you know will cause them to rule in your favor. And
Yeah.
oftentimes cities just don't want to take that risk, and they would rather just pay out some instead of having to risk $20 million if it come down to that.
Right. I wanted to circle back real quick. Earlier, you asked me what my main goals towards police reform would be, and there's a commenter. I know we're not taking questions or anything from commenters yet, but Mike One wrote, all body cameras need to be recording live at all times. Maybe not when they're in the bathroom, but should be loaded to the cloud for safekeeping. Purposefully blocking or covering up the camera should be instant dismissal, and that was actually something that was implemented in that executive order that Jared Polis put out, where I don't think it's instant dismissal, but they will be, reprimanded for covering or turning off body camera. And I think that that's something that we all can kind of agree. Like, there's there should be no reason other than going to the bathroom or displaying personal cell phone numbers and stuff like that, that any body camera footage should be turned off or edited in any way to, try to block transparency to the public.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I don't know if I necessarily agree with them being sort of live streamed and you can just kind of tune in whenever you want. Um, I think I think that there is some circumstances where the department may want to keep that body camera footage away from the public for a number of different reasons, and I think, they should have the ability to at least go to a judge and say, hey, here's why we think this body camera footage should be kept from the public at this time. And maybe, have a time frame where they have to release the body cam after so much time. Um,
Yeah.
let's see. Fishroy, uh, he asks if we think that civil liability against cop would actually change anything. And he adds that most American cops, included, don't have any tangible assets. That's why people sue the city. Well, I'll just say that civil liability against police officers, most of the time when you file a case for, a violation of rights, you sue not just the officer. You sue everyone involved, which includes the city. I don't necessarily think that, you know people go into a lawsuit thinking that how many assets can I seize from this police officer or whatnot. I know that at least attorneys really don't think that way. They sue the city
Yeah.
because the city is liable for those damages based on the fact that their officer wasn't properly trained or their actions were condoned by a certain, by a city in itself by hiring that
Yeah.
person or continuing to employ
Yeah.
them.
And that's something that's big on these lawsuits. I see a lot of people asking all the time, like, why didn't this person sue? And I've met a lot of auditors that are saying, I'm not trying to sue the taxpayer and get a bunch of money, but I think the important part of filing a lawsuit against the police officer, the police agency, and the municipality that agency works for is for policy change. And most of these like if you look at CSPD, Colorado Springs Police Department versus Brown, it was the brother filed a lawsuit against one of or two of the officers for excessive force, and they did get a cash settlement. However, the most important thing that came out of that case was that forced CSPD to adopt body cams and change their policy on how they interact with the public during traffic stops. And I think that is so much more important than any cash settlement that anybody can get.
Yeah, that's very true, and you're so right about that. Another thing I think that people should consider is that when you sue a city, you're not necessarily suing the citizens and their tax money directly. Um,
Right.
Most cities, particularly bigger municipalities, have insurance that covers the city. And when you sue, it comes from the insurance or the city's budget if they don't want to make that claim. So if a city, for example, gets sued for a large sum of money and the case is successful, they might, invoke their insurance to pay off that premium. And in a way, that still does kind of cost the people of that city more money because it's very likely that their insurance premiums will go up. But it's not like you're taking $20 million out of the tax revenue pockets of those citizens. So it's just important to make that distinction that, a lot of people say they don't want to sue because that would be sort of a robbery of the average citizen, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So what do you think? And I know, I wanted to ask this question particularly because of the bias that we were talking about earlier. What do you think is the biggest misconception about police that circulates amongst the general public?
Yeah, I've put a lot of thought into that, and I think my main answer would be the whole protect and serve aspect. If you look at, I'm in Colorado Springs, so a lot of my answers are going to revolve around that specific agency. But Colorado Springs has their YouTube, or not their Google page, and it has the reviews and everything. And there are just review after review complaining that, hey, I called 911, I had an intruder in my house, and they told me to go downstairs and check if he was still there. And it's like, well, isn't that why we have the police? And it wasn't until I was introduced to by a bunch of these auditors that I've met along this whole YouTube journey. They've introduced me to Supreme Court cases like Gonzalez versus Castle Rock or Warren versus District of Columbia, and realizing that the police actually have no specific legal duty to provide protection to individual plaintiffs is, that's something I had no idea about. And I think, and it took me so much work to find that out that I'm sure the average citizen doesn't understand that fully either, even though it's a, Supreme Court precedent from 1981, but nobody still gets it, even though it's almost 40-year-old doctrine.
Yeah, I agree. That is a huge misconception about law enforcement, and it ushers back thoughts of the primordial stages of police force, and that it's still very similar to how it was before we set all these precedents around what officers can and cannot do. I mean, if you think about it, police forces and departments are really just private organizations that have been organized and hired and funded by municipalities and cities. And it's not something that although they operate as this quasi government organization, that's really not that's not where their authority is bound to. That's where they get their authority, but that's not where their authority begins and ends. It's sort of like I said, this sort of quasi system where it's more so private than government, yet they work very closely with the government. It almost doesn't make sense, how they can not be obligated to save someone or do anything really. And I mean that's why they call it a call for service. Sorry, a call for service, and not anything else, because that's what you're doing when you call an officer or when you call the police. You're calling for their services that they provide as if they are any other industry. And that that tells you a lot about sort of the parameters that they work with.
Yeah It's always been my personal belief that if we're designing, if we're looking at police officers and law enforcement agencies, whether it's your local or a federal agency, those agencies are the most conspicuous form of government. It's the portion of government that we see the most. And so if we're defining our terms, and the state is the monopoly on force. They're the ones that control the initiation of violence, and there's no competition. Like you said, it's just an agency that pretty much sold itself to the state, so the state runs it. So there's no competition in services. There's no competition in wielding force or subjugating others, or forcing people to obey commands even. And I know that a lot of people will say that, having a competition of private police forces wouldn't necessarily be competition, but it would be more violent conflict, and on a larger scale, some would call that war. But I think it's very interesting that we've decided to and have allowed a monopoly on the initiation of force and allowed it to be controlled by the state.
Yeah, not just necessarily controlled by the state, but funded and actively promoted by the state. And
Yeah.
I think when you sort of dive into the whole area of private policing, it gets into a dangerous spot with capitalism in particular, because we're sort of stuck in this perpetuum where we need competition to create a better product. as far as policing goes. But you have to be careful not to reinvent the very same product that you're trying to compete with. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the major factors about private policing is that, only the people who can afford private policing will have private policing. And then that creates a disparity in protection, and it sort of discourages the state-run police who already, maybe do a bad job. I mean, if they don't have to protect the people who actually can make change, then what's going to incentivize them to do so?
Well, yeah, and I understand that. I think the way I see it is, if there's a competition between different services, it allows for the private industries to make a better product and to do things for cheaper. And I think it would turn out to be something similar to cell phone service. Back in the 90s, it was extremely expensive. Not a lot of people had them. They weren't widely available. But as they become widely available and more people sign on to them, just like your internet services, the price goes down. And I mean, these ISPs, they make, tons and tons of money. And that's afforded us cheap internet service. And I think that would happen with private police agencies as well. Now, on the same note, I also think that there's an issue. Like, you look at AT&T and Comcast, right? Those are the two available internet services in my area. Now, there are 100 other internet service providers that can give me service to Colorado Springs, but they don't, more than likely because they're in cahoots with the ones that do provide service here. So it's almost like a duopoly, but, maintained behind closed doors. But without any type of free market, I don't see the police getting better. I think that when they have a monopoly controlled by the state, their incentive is for more crime. The worse a situation gets and the more crime that we have in our local areas, the more police are funded, the more money they get.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I just want to shout out Jesse Vera here. Thanks for the $5, my man. I think another big, issue that sort of stems from, the whole crime and policing cycle. It's sort of like this symbiotic relationship between crime and policing. Is
Right.
the prison industrial complex, and that system. For example, you can find many articles who point out the fact that lots of pro police funding comes from the private prison industry, and
Yeah.
it's sort of just, they have a lot of politicians in their back pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely going to be pros and cons, but without a viable option to opt out of it, I think we're going to continue to get what we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very valid perspective to have, and it's sort of like this problem is it's such a problem at this point that there's not an umbrella fix. Like, there's no band-aid that you can stick on this problem. It's just going to get to a point to where either a massive change happens or the entire industry collapses. And it's difficult to say which one will, get there first.
And that's why I think auditing just as a whole is so important, because without it, I mean, I don't know which way the pendulum is swinging at this point. It seems to favor against our civil rights, but I do think that without auditors doing what they do, it would get worse a lot quicker.
Yeah, I agree. So I just want to. I got about 2 more questions for you, and then we'll take some questions from the chat, and then maybe take some phone calls.
Sounds great.
So, do you have any advice to give auditors and First Amendment activists?
I mean, other than what I mentioned earlier, knowing the specific laws, knowing your rights, and And I always say don't engage, but I know that auditing is specifically, geared towards engaging law enforcement officers. So, I think it just really just boils down to know the law, know your rights. That's it.
Yeah, I mean those two things right there will definitely serve, for the better interest of the people, no doubt.
But yeah, and film horizontal.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, that definitely makes our job a lot easier for sure.
Yeah, less editing.
So, what are your plans for your channel moving forward? Do you have anything in particular that's coming up, or just where are you heading?
Well, I'm not 100% sure. I very much enjoy what I currently do. A lot of what I create is often demonetized. Much of it I demonetize myself because I know it won't get monetized. So I was thinking about perhaps starting a live show where I can show things that I think would be demonetized to, just kind of help with the YouTube algorithm or whatnot. As far as sticking with auditing, I think I will. I certainly want to. I would like the channel to hold some real weight as far as policy change. So I'm looking at different options on how I can do that. Not just focus on the police, but also government officials that are in charge of our police agencies, and trying to figure out, how to establish civilian review boards and how to get into some of those different organizations so that we can affect true change without just showing specific incidents. But aside from that, my wife and I were thinking about starting a family farm, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. But and also the last thing, I've been considering criminal psychology and trying to break down different cases of when people confess to murders that they didn't do, or confess to murders that they did do, and try to dive into some interesting stuff about that, and maybe some more long form documentary style things about some big stories.
I think all that sounds really good. I'd considered sort of dipping my toes in that true crime and false confession sort of niche. I
Yeah.
think I'm sort of going in a different direction, still kind of following that long form idea, but focusing more so on real world stories. And I'll have more details about that as I go. But I think that you would do a really good job at doing that type of content. And I'd love to see something like a true crime, and especially what you were talking about government officials. It'd be really nice to see some video essays or something like that, sort of talking about the intricacies of the politics that is behind policing, and informing people about how they can go about establishing civilian review boards in their towns, or just something along those lines. I think that that's something that everyone in the auditing community, on YouTube at least, doesn't really get exposed to enough, and that would be
Yeah.
great. Sorry. Let's take some questions, I guess, from the chat. If you guys want to throw up some questions, and I'll pick a few. I see one right now. ATA, do you get demonetized? Yes, I do occasionally. It hasn't been nearly as bad recently, and I've sort of learned to, um, you know, pick and choose my content and try to make my points in ways that are accessible to everyone. And I really want that to be a principle of the channel. So, lately YouTube and I have had a much better relationship than we did when I first started. I don't know if you want to elaborate more on that, LackLuster, but
I'm sorry, I was reading another question. I missed the last portion of your last sentence. I apologize. It was about demonetization, right? And
yeah,
how
yeah.
it's gotten better.
Yeah, well, I just
Um,
was curious about your whole experience with that, and if you want to tell the audience, about the kind of things that you're going through with YouTube.
Yeah, it's interesting. Their monetization structure and their terms of services change frequently, and the way that they judge your channel changes just as frequently. And so I've had quite a bit of a monetization issue. It's gotten to the point for me specifically where if I show somebody even getting arrested, then it's automatically demonetized, even if it was peaceful. The subject puts his hands behind his back, cuts are placed. There's no violence per se. Those will even get demonetized for me. So it's a tricky little game you have to play.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, it's not necessarily a uniform. They don't uniformly police this kind of stuff. Like some videos where you would think they would be demonetized aren't, and you may show something that's even less, vulgar and get demonetized.
Or even worse, I put up a video a week and a half ago that's demonetized, and I sent up a claim to the higher ups at YouTube, and they re-reviewed it, so it got 2 forms of human review, and it was demonetized both times. But that same video is on 4 different channels, and I checked, they are also monetized. So it's all kind of a dice game.
Yeah, I agree. Eva says, what do you use to research local, state, and federal laws? And what are some resources the public can use to get educated on the laws that apply to them? A lot of research, of course, comes from case law and, just building a foundational knowledge of case law. It's something that you can't really just, dip your toes into. It kind of takes a while to get extremely familiar with how to find the cases that apply to whatever you're looking for. But as far as laws go, pretty much every state has their laws on a website somewhere. And I'm sure that if you just Google, California state statutes, you will get the website that contains all of their statutes. And it's particularly useful to look for the penal codes, because that's what you really need to know about. There's also a website called municode.com that has a huge database of local laws, and it's not a complete database, but many of the cities, their ordinances are listed there, and it's relatively easy to find it that way as well. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, it's about the same. I'm still definitely on a learning curve compared to you, but Google is certainly your friend. A lot of times when I do research on specific stories, when I'm doing a deep dive sort of video for an incident, the auditor themselves will usually have some really good insight on where to look also, or what codes specifically to look up.
Right. Sebastian Barrios says, why shouldn't I show my ID to an officer? I understand that I'm within my rights to not do so, but I don't understand why I should deny it to begin with. And I'll let you take the lead on that one, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, absolutely. I get asked that question a lot. And in fact, I've been saving screenshots of people asking me that question so I could get more of a further of a more deep video for it. But the most general answer is because how much power do you want your state to have? If we give them the right to identify anybody on the street at any point in time, that's just the first step. Typically the government will take rights and not give them back, and you can't vote yourself out of them typically. But after the ID, then what? Now they're allowed to search your car, and we'll give up that right. And then the next one will be, and I know it sounds kind of egregious and an overstepping, but you can see it throughout history. It would get to a point where now the police officers, which is just the government, coming into your house at any time that they want without a warrant. It's just baby steps until they get the big picture.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And to add to that, you have to consider the smaller scale implications of it too. I mean, particularly with the officer that you're so willing to give your ID to, that reaffirms all of the misconceptions they have about their authority, and then you are essentially serving as a segue to an officer abusing someone else's rights. So it's sort of like a contagion in a way. I mean, if you infect an officer's mind with the idea that they can get away with just violating this right, what's to stop the officer from doing that to the next person or going even further? So it's not just about the grander implications of the government as a whole, but also with that particular officer involved.
Yeah. Joe Cool, he's in chat. What's up, Joe? He actually asked, or him and, I'm sorry, John Denicola first asked what happened to the cop that threatened to arrest me on my first video. He got reprimanded. They wouldn't say how they punished him, but I got a paper saying that they investigated themselves and he was guilty of, I can't remember how they said it, bad judgment, basically, but they wouldn't tell me what they did to him. And then Joe Cool also asked about a lawsuit I'm involved in for misidentification. And yes, that's me. The lawsuit, I can't talk about it much because we're about to file our motions this week, but I am being sued for defamation and false light. And it's, in my opinion, is completely bogus. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, if you want to help out with the legal proceedings, there's a GoFundMe down in the description.
Yeah. I was gonna mention that there's certainly some, just by watching the video and such, it's very a crazy thing to think that you're being sued. And I think, if people want to help, they should definitely check out that link. Let's see if we can find another question here.
Mm-hmm.
When do you think officers will leave public photographers alone, if ever? Well, I think that there's definitely been some progress made in that area. And I think that you could almost exclusively contribute that to the First Amendment movement and all of these auditors who are going out and making police officers aware that you can photograph in public. And I think of one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that right, the First Amendment right to photograph in public is not something that is globally accepted. That is almost exclusively tied to North America, Canada and America, and the United States in particular. Like, for example, in Germany, you can't do that. You cannot just go out and photograph people in the public without their permission. And if you're doing, like, say, TV work or something like that, you have to have very strict permits to film in public, and it's a much different ecosystem than it is here.
Yeah.
And I think that police officers sort of having misconceptions about that, it you can see how that would lead to a society that's different, that doesn't respect that right, and that doesn't adhere to those certain values.
Yeah, that is certainly interesting, and this can double back to a couple of our questions that we discussed earlier. There's an auditor right here in Colorado Springs, and he hasn't created any content in years now, but he back in 2017 was detained for 45 minutes for filming on a public sidewalk, and he was filming the front entrance of a police station. And why lawsuits are so important in these circumstances, because he sued, and regardless of the settlement, which was, I think, $47,000, he implemented policy change. So by a specific date, the entire department had to be re-educated on public photography and the First Amendment. And in doing so, the department created a 10-minute roll call video, and it explained the First Amendment, when and why we're allowed to film in public. And I think that was a huge win, and it was only for this municipality and this agency. But to implement that sort of change is just monumental. And I think we'll start seeing that spill over into some of the bigger and smaller agencies around the state, and hopefully eventually nationwide.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is an interesting question from Joe Cool, and I think, I'm going to try to skirt around the politics of this question, but I definitely think it's something that we could probably address, and that is, do we think these protests are the beginning of a huge change for the better? I'll let you kind of take the lead on that one, if you feel
sure.
comfortable answering it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the beginning of something big. I mean, you see, it's very difficult to dissect this without getting into the politics, because, again, I'm on neither the side of Antifa or, the Back the Blue or any of that stuff. But I do think that these protests, whether the incident was justified or not, or what you think about the initial incident, I think that these protests and this obedience is going to affect great change. And the fact that it's exposing it, it's bringing a lot more attention to it, and people are becoming more aware of the injustices from police agencies.
Yeah, I agree with that. The thing about it is, I have two kind of points that I want to make. First of all, that, if you look back in history at, for example, the Rodney King incident, like we were talking about earlier, we had one of the biggest riots in American history happen after that, but nothing really changed, and there was nothing, police weren't held accountable, and you could even argue that it got worse. So
Yeah.
I think that while there is the potential for change to happen, that, all the protesting needs to, bear in mind that there's thin ice to be walked on here, and it has the potential just as much to change for the better as it does to change for the worse. And
Yeah, I'm on board with that too.
a lot of the conduct that we're seeing, sprout up throughout these protests are counterproductive, in my opinion. And I'm not saying that it's the protesters themselves, or, I'm not drawing any conclusions on what exactly is happening there. But the narratives that are being drafted because of those incidences, they have as much potential to destroy that whole movement as they do to craft a path for progression moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great point.
I'll just answer EGA's question really quick. Have you ever performed a First Amendment audit? No, I have not. I am not an auditor. I consider myself to be a reporter who is reporting on this movement and sort of trying to inject some educational value into it. I've never claimed to be an auditor. I will never conduct an audit. That is just not what I do. I'm using my skills in a way to help guide this movement in a certain direction without being particularly attached and involved in it. I would like to just make some, observations about the movement. That's really all I do. So I'm not an auditor whatsoever. What do we think about News Now Patrick's interaction the other day? I don't think I've seen that.
I'm unfamiliar with it as well.
Let's see.
But I'll put it up on the list.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take a look at it. I've only covered one of his interactions in the past. And, I'm not particularly keen on revisiting auditors. I like to look for fresher content and not harp too much about the conduct of one particular auditor. I have done videos on, multiple videos on particular auditors in the past, but it's just not really the sort of thing I like to harp on too much. What do you think? This is from Road to Prison. What do you think about law enforcement referring to citizens as civilians?
I would say me personally, I think that's a result of the militarization of the police, because police officers are civilians. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
The only people that aren't are military. So it's I think realistically it's just a form of misinformation. I don't think that, at least the times that I've seen it, I don't think it's meant to be derogatory towards the citizen.
Yeah,
but I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with the cop's ego. I have no idea.
I don't really necessarily think that it's meant to be demeaning in any way either. I think a lot of it has to do with the culture of policing and how it's kind of shifted into this way of life, instead of just a job. It doesn't have the same type of culture as like working at Taco Bell. It's not
Yeah.
like you don't have, you don't go home and hang up your Taco Bell uniform and be, feel like you've accomplished like a world altering thing. And there's no culture built up around working at Taco Bell where you can walk up to any other Taco Bell employee and, just sort of share your Taco Bell experience. That's just not, it's not as invasive as that. I mean, that may exist for Taco Bell employees, but it's not like it is with police officers. It's sort of like it's a way of life, and they really want to differentiate themselves from the average person through the work that they do.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. We'll take one more chat question, and then we'll try to take a couple of phone calls, and we'll wrap it up. Let's see here. Unlawful arrest. Comply now and complain later is a question from Joe Cole again. What do you think about that?
Man, there's a lot of nuance to that question, but I'll take a swing at it. I mean, realistically, it's going to depend on the circumstances of your interaction. I know that there's somewhat of an idea that you should be able to defend yourself against unlawful arrest. However, I think because, as we discussed earlier, police have the monopoly on initiating force, it's going to lead to a lot more problems in the future, up to and including death. So, that's a difficult one to answer without any other relevant information. But I would say, for me personally, and some of you guys might not like this, but if I was being arrested, I'd probably comply and, file suit in court later.
Yeah, I mean, that's my whole perspective on it. Personally, I don't believe that there's any situation where taking out justice on the street against an unlawful arrest will end favorably for the citizen. The fact is that you're outmanned, you're outgunned. Nothing that one individual is going to do is going to result in anything positive for anyone. And
Yeah.
and as difficult as it is to say this, because I understand that it is hard to find legal representation, particularly if you are of a lower socioeconomic status. But
Yeah.
you have to consider, is this worth dying for? Is this worth risking your life over? Is this short jail term or whatever it may be, is that worth it? And in my opinion, there's so much more to live for than revenge or something like in that same light. And if you have even the slightest inkling that maybe you can turn this interaction into a lawsuit, if that's the case, if you are in fact a victim of misconduct, then that's certainly the route that you should take, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can open up the fan line here, and we'll we'll try to take a call. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work with 3 people on the line, so we'll just see how this goes.
Sure. Where's SJVT? He said he was going to call in.
Let's see. I'm not sure if I can actually have
a third call.
Yeah, I don't know. See, just to let everyone listening know, this is still a very experimental program that I'm using to conduct this broadcast. So this is kind of a test as much as it is a live thing, just to see if this is even possible. Let me see.
Well, if it works, that'd be great.
Yeah, if it works, that'd be great. If not, then I think it's possible, but I'm still working out all of the fundamentals to see if this is actually going to function correctly. Let me see here. Yeah, I guess not. That's tragic.
That's all right. I'm still open to more questions from chat if you're looking for that. If not,
yeah, we can just take some more questions from the chat. Sorry, guys. Apologize for that. I will definitely have that worked out before the next broadcast, and I'll be sure to bring you back on at some point in the future, LackLuster, so that we can take some calls from the community, because I'm pretty sure it's possible, but I just don't think that it's like working right now.
Yeah, no worries.
If anyone wanted to call and has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat really quick. RJ Hale says, are the police allowed to lie? Are police allowed to lie about the reason for a traffic stop? Yes, definitely. They're under no legal obligations to tell you the truth about anything. And as crazy as that sounds, that's not a universal idea either. Much like how recording in public is not like that in every country. So is lying to the police. Like for example, in Canada, police officers are not allowed to lie to you during interrogation, and in America, that's not the case. So
yeah.
it's there are very different standards for that. Out of all the auditors, which one do you think that other auditors should act like? What do you think about that?
Again, as I stated earlier, I think it's important that we have a wide variety of different personalities out there in the streets. I think the ones that affect the most change are probably the ones that are the most professional in demeanor. But
do you have?
I don't know if there's any one specific.
I was going to say, do you have any auditors that you're a fan of their style?
Well, I really like it in regards to the cool demeanor. I would point towards Rowdy Podcast, James Madison, a few others like that, where the interactions are, and actually James Freeman is one of my absolute favorites. Johnny 5-0 as well. Most of those guys seem to, and SJVT, all those guys seem to have a very professional composure when dealing with the police, and they just kind of escalate force with the police officers, which I can respect. You kind of get what you give.
Yeah, I like that list as well. I think that someone who's often overlooked but definitely should be put on that list is the Batosai, and
Oh yeah.
I was on Rowdy's podcast, or maybe it was ASD's podcast, one of the two, who asked me about, I think it was ASD, who asked me about sort of the Mount Rushmore of auditors, and I failed to mention the Batosai, and I regret that to this day. I think about that all the time, and he's definitely someone who deserves, because not only is he professional and calm, but he actually went on to establish, precedents, which is
Yeah,
great.
yeah, that's, and I mean, that should be like one of the big goals, is establishing policy and precedent.
Right. Jesse Vara, thank you for the 10. Is it right that police do not have to respond to any emergency call that they do not feel a need to? Well, yes and no. I mean, they do not have a legal obligation to, come and save your life, for example. The courts have established that. But it's also important to recognize that while there is case law saying that, that doesn't mean that there won't be a circumstance in the future that may change that interpretation. So
Yeah,
it's, there's definitely there's change on the horizon for sure. I mean, like we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of protesting going on. There's a lot of things involving police activity that certainly has the potential to create a lot of change. But will we see that manifest in our better interest as the public? That's another question as a whole, and whether or not they are required to respond is certainly going to be an element of that change.
yeah. I was a dual function firefighter paramedic for the city of Los Angeles. It was LAFD for a number of years, and so we were obligated to respond to all medical 911 calls, based on the idea that if you don't, like somebody calls and says, "Hey, I've got my tooth hurts or something," and you go, "Well, go to the dentist," then that person dies of a heart attack. Now the agency can get sued. So I imagine that, in regard to your question, I don't know this 100%, but if you call 911, they will at least put in a call for service. Whether or not they show up and do the job that you're expecting them to do is questionable. And we spoke about Warren versus DC and Castle Rock versus Gonzalez, where both of those Supreme Court decisions ruled that there's no constitutionally protected property interest for police to actually respond or to protect a specific citizen.
Right. Kiwoka asks, do you think the precedent of Turner v. Driver will be expanded for other infrastructure? As in, will auditors be arrested for filming schools, railways, farms, and have to go to court? I think that an important thing to understand is that let's put aside the Turner versus Driver precedent for a moment and understand that the First Amendment doesn't guarantee you the right to speak absolutely, as in there are certain circumstances, as particularly involving your time and place and how you are speaking, that do limit your First Amendment rights. And a school, for example, can be a limited area of free speech. And that also depends on who you are. So if you're an auditor, for example, going into a school that they've never been to, chances are the courts are not going to uphold your First Amendment rights there. But say, for example, you're a student of that school and you decide that you want to express your disdain for a certain policy, then the courts have ruled that students have a right to protest. So it's just important to understand that the First Amendment's not universal. You can't go anywhere that you want to and exercise your First Amendment rights. There are time, place, and manner restrictions on free speech.
Breaking away from that a little bit, EGA, I see your question. EGA is asking us when we're going to cover Leon Valley, and just to answer that for you, I've been talking with Otto and a couple of the other people that were there for the initial incident, and it's still kind of ongoing. And I think Justin Pulliam is really the guy to look to for Leon Valley specifically. But I do expect as this thing comes to a close, you'll probably see some content from either one of us.
Yeah, I try to stay away from interactions and circumstances which are still unfolding, and I like to have a full picture and be able to give educational value and tell you why. And oftentimes it's difficult to do that without all of the information, and when things are so subject to change. So like LackLuster said, maybe in the future. Let's see. We'll take a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up here. Let's see. If you see anything that pops out to you in the chat, feel free to take it up.
Will do.
Do you think auditors could be targets by police because of what they're doing? Yeah, I mean, certainly. If you look, for example, at in this, what I'm about to tell you is it's surrounded in conspiracy. It's definitely an interesting story, and it's one of the first stories I ever read that really got me interested in policing and the whole practical aspects of it. And it's the story of an auditor named Auditor as a loose term, because at the time auditing wasn't really a big thing, but his name was John Lang. And I'll type that in the chat. You guys can look that up. His story was particularly interesting because he had been doing a bunch of different sort of like amateur exposés on Fresno PD, I believe it was. And he ended up, being killed in a house fire, but also having multiple stab wounds. And there was a lot of, definitely a lot of unanswered questions left with that story. And I think that there's a possibility that he may have been a victim of retaliation. Would it be from the police or maybe someone else? It's really hard to say. But I just want to note, do I think it's possible? Yes. I mean, here's another example. If you look at the female police officer that was a whistleblower, I can't even remember the department or her name, but she was fired for bringing to light a lot of the things that her department were doing, that was corrupt. And, if they can't necessarily, I'm not saying that you have to be worried about, if you're an auditor, you have to be worried that police might come in your house and kill you. But I think that you do have to be worried about the professional implications of your actions. And, just be aware that you're going against the grain of an entire industry and a well-established arm of the government. So there is the potential for retaliation. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. The most recent example I could come up with, I recently covered Amagansett Press and Watching the Watchmen, and they were having a yard sale, and the cops showed up 4 different times to try to shut them down because they were 7 minutes early, and then your sign was a little too big, and it just seemed like they were targeted for harassment, and even by the cops' own admission in a couple of portions of the videos, like, oh, you and your First Amendment stuff and blah blah blah. So it's obvious that they had developed a relationship based on his auditing over a number of years, and again, this is all alleged too. It's not saying that, yes, hey, let's go target this guy, but it certainly looks like that's what was going on. And I definitely think that if you audit where you live all the time, they're going to get to know you, and their views towards you are definitely going to influence their decision on how to deal with you.
Yeah, well said. And I think that that is definitely something that you should consider. Um, and that, I just want people to understand that that auditing is inherently dangerous, whether or not that comes from retaliation or whether that comes from the economic burden that it can take. I mean, being in jail can take huge toll on you financially and emotionally, and not just on you but your family as well. So you have to weigh the risks and the benefits, and really think about whether auditing is for you before you decide to do it. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
We'll take one more question, then we'll wrap it up here. Let's see.
You got it.
Scrolling up. Anybody got a question? What do you think about the decision of the Supreme Court ruling in Kansas versus Glover on license plates? Well, I'll have to look that up really quick. I think that.
Actually, I'm not familiar on the cuff with that one either.
Yeah, I think that I actually have covered this case before. That it's basically saying that police officers are allowed to run license plates whenever they want, essentially. And I talked about this briefly on the last broadcast as well, but the courts came to that conclusion based on a couple of different case laws that were established in the Supreme Court. One was Katz v. United States, and one was Harris v. United States. The Katz case basically said that officers can look at things in plain view. Well, that may have been the Harris case. I kind of get them mixed up because they're so similar. But the real conclusion here is that your tag is designed to give identifying information about your vehicle. And it would be counterproductive to assume that accessing that information is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a tag. So I can see why a court would come to the conclusion that your tag is not private and the information associated with your tag is not private. It kind of, I very much believe in individual liberty and freedoms, and I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you should have a tag. You should have to have a tag on your vehicle, and all these philosophical ideologies about regulating highways and vehicles and all of that. But within the current system, it makes sense to me that officers would be able to run a tag. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I have to add to what you just said is it's very similar to when auditors record personal license plates. And I do see in the chat, looking up the info based on your tag isn't necessarily plain view because you're getting more information off of that tag, which is something that we can't do as citizens. So it's a difficult decision, really, because on one side, I don't want any auditor or any person being arrested or ID'd or detained, what have you, for filming a license plate. But at the same time, the public, the information behind that license plate and looking it up should be private in lieu of some sort of offense.
Yeah, and I think Fishroy here makes a good point and an interesting point on this whole thing, and it goes back to what I was saying about whether or not we should even have these type of databases and whether or not the government should be able to access that information. That's something I may or may not agree with, but he says that Fishroy says simply that it's the information attached to your tag is already their information. It's in their database. Um, they own that information essentially. So the question is not really whether that information that's attached to your tag is private or not. It really is just about the number and that, because they already own that information. I mean, you gave it to them when you agreed to the
Yeah.
terms of driving on their highways. But I think that what the Glover case really asked was, does the officer have a right to viewing and using that information to effectuate a stop? Is that a violation of the Fourth Amendment? And
Yeah.
I don't think it is, because of the way the system is currently created, but that doesn't mean that I agree with that system.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Well, I think that'll do it for today. I mean, we've already went an hour and 45 minutes here. I don't want to take up everybody's whole day, especially not yours. I mean, once again, I sincerely appreciate you coming on the show. And I look forward I look forward to having you back, and having this discussion again, and maybe taking some calls next time.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with or tell people to look out for?
I guess the biggest thing I'd want to advocate or put out there is stay sharp and look for all these big auditors like SJVT and all the auditors doing all the big work. Those are the ones who really put forth the effort and all the risk for, other than me getting sued, but put forth a ton of the risk that not only makes the community possible, but the activism possible, and then channels like ours possible. So make sure you guys support all those auditors first and foremost.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely check out all the channels he mentioned, and like he said, give them your support, because there wouldn't be channels that can cover this interaction, channels like ours, without them. And one thing I wanted to bring up was that I'll be covering an interaction that you have previously covered tomorrow. A new episode of ATA will come out that's featuring the interaction from North Dakota News Now, who was denied access to a courtroom.
Yeah.
That was an interesting case, and it was certainly interesting to write about. And it's one of the longer episodes of ATA, and I encourage you all to check it out. There's some really good information there. And be sure to go down to the description of this video and follow LackLuster. Check out all of his content. He's putting out some very good work. And I highly encourage you to watch the speeding ticket video, which is super informative. And if you've ever had a speeding ticket, you will definitely gain some knowledge from that video. Once again, man, it was great talking to you, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. Sounds good, John. Thanks for having me on. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the second episode of the ATA radio show. I hope you had a good time. Apologize for the technical difficulties. I will certainly get that worked out very soon in the future. And thanks again to LackLuster for joining us, and tune in next week for another episode where we will hopefully have another guest. If not, we will be discussing a topic of sorts, and we'll definitely be taking calls. Thank you again for joining in. I sincerely appreciate all of your support and all of you joining me. And shout out to ASD Docs for modding for us today. And be sure to check out his channel as well. He does some very interesting journalism that covers a lot of different topics. And we may be working together on a project in the future, so stay tuned for that as well. We'll see you all next week, and check us out tomorrow.